Today's scripture reading is going to be 1 Timothy 1, 5 through 11. 1 Timothy 1, 5 through 11. The aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a certain faith. Certain persons, by swerving from these, have wandered away into vain discussion, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. Now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and the disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted.
Good morning. As Clint has already noted, but I certainly want to reiterate our appreciation for your being here today. Of course, to our own members, but then to the good number of guests that we have with us today as well. Sam is out of town preaching just for this morning. He'll be back this evening and he will be speaking. And do just want you to know that I'll have a few things to say about Sam this evening. He has really officially completed the preacher training program and has completed a lot of work, a great amount of work, including taking his Hebrew final this last week, of which he scored a 93%. And that is a huge, huge test. I gave Hoyt a copy of it, and I think Hoyt took the test, but in any case, no. But he did that, and then he also quoted for me just the other day the 25th chapter of Matthew, the whole chapter, all 46 verses. You know, he's done all the Sermon on the Mount, 121 verses of 5, 6, and 7. He's done all of Acts chapter 2, and about 400 or 500 other verses as well. So he's done a good job with that. And yes, Hoyt.
He got a 95.
95. Excuse me, I slided him by 2%. The grader was gracious, but in any case. Also want you to know that received a phone call from Brother John Skoltz this morning from South Africa. And of course, we keep in constant contact. And ever since both of us now know that we have WhatsApp, I mean, that's just, it's a great way to communicate and it's free. But the congregation needs to know that John and Lynn Skoltz are going to be coming to California. And we're bringing them over, and not only us, but the good brethren. And we've got a whole row here from Clovis today. And been in conversation and communication with the elders in Clovis. Clovis has been helping to support John for some time significantly. We've done some help too, and then of course the benevolence as well. But so we're flying both John and Lynn over. They'll be coming over in February. They'll leave February 25th. It takes a little over 24 hours to get here. They'll be here February 26th, be here for 2 weeks, and be returning about March 12th. John's going to be able to speak for us here at Los Osos. He's also going to be able to speak over in Clovis, and there are a lot of other things that we've planned going on. But I want to tell you, as excited as I am, they are so excited, and it's been a long time since they've been to the States, and they've never been to California. And so we're very, very pleased that this is going to work out and them coming over. So just want you to know that. You may want to put in your calendars that if you've got some flexibility and are able to stay, don't already have something planned, love for you to be able to meet Brother and Sister John and Lynn Skoltz, wonderful Christians from South Africa. Take your Bibles and turn over Romans 13. Would you please? Romans chapter 13. And what I want to start with here, and as you're turning to Romans chapter 13, I want you to get there first so you can just have it in your lap, ready to look at just a few verses there. That is, we're just going to look at the first 7 verses to make a very brief point. But James McPherson, who lived from 1736 to 1796, a Scottish writer, literary collector, and politician. And I emphasize Scottish because I figure McCurdy over here would appreciate that. Because James McPherson was a pretty sharp individual. But he made this comment. He says, anarchy is hatred of human authority, atheism of divine authority. Two sides of the same whole. I think we all understand and appreciate the fact that when we look at government and we look at nations and government, civil government, that anarchy just results in chaos. And remove the principle, remove the reality in the minds of people of God. And replace that with atheism, and we understand that it's nothing more than an assault against a divine authority that should be guiding the lives of each and every one of us. But these type of individuals will understand, they recognize that you need law, you need order, you need commandments, you need boundaries and parameters within society for society to survive, to thrive, to grow, to develop, to be the people that we ought to be as human beings. Former Prime Minister William Pitt, who lived from 1759 to 1806, he astutely observed, where law ends, tyranny begins. And if the type of tyranny resolves itself into a tyrannical dictator, that is one who basically takes the law into his own hands, and he alone decides what is going to be right and wrong and what's going to fly and what's not going to fly. We understand the great danger of that. But there again, what it shows that there needs to be law and order, but we want to make sure that it is indeed that law, that there are boundaries. And civil government appreciates that, needs to appreciate that. And then an English cleric that I've read after various times throughout the years by the name of Caleb Colton made this observation, and I think it's very good, as he noted, law and equity are two things that God hath joined together, but which man hath put asunder. Now, obviously, he is using a play on terms of even what Jesus talked about in the relationship of marriage, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And he has taken, I think, in a very clever way, and showed the importance of law and equity, that law is important, and that we talk about equity, we talk about that which is equitable or equal rights, but law and equity are two things that God has joined together, and we see law, we see equity all throughout the Scripture. But man has no problem of putting this asunder. Now, as much as we see that this is very important, in human nations, governments, what we see all about us, and we have learned, hopefully, through history, some of the lessons, that how dangerous anarchy is, and how dangerous it is that when those that try to become very antinomian, that is, they're very much against law, that what that results in, and even the Bible addresses its importance in civil government. This is Romans 13, beginning at verse 1. Let's look at it together. Romans 13. The Apostle Paul, by inspiration, reminds the church where? Rome. Where the head of the civil government of the Roman Empire was. Let every person, and he's writing to Christians, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. And those that exist, that is these authorities, these governments, have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who's in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, and an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. I'll tell you one thing, we could talk all day long about Romans 13, but this is what I want to share with you. That here we see, even through the wisdom of God's inspired word, that there is a need for civil government, for law and for order, for boundaries, for parameters, for rules and for regulations. And what he says there, and there's a two-edged sword in this case, and pun perhaps intended, but the two-edged sword that exists in this is that when we are not law-abiding citizens, I'll tell you what, we can be judged in two ways. One, we can be judged by civil government, and we might very well be arrested or fined, or I'll tell you, for those that commit criminal or capital crimes, do you think that God has always shown that government has the right to exercise capital punishment? The sword was not used for trimming their toenails. But not only that not only do we stand potentially before the judge of government if we do not obey the laws, but we will one day stand before the greatest judge of all, God himself, will we not? And here we see then the importance of civil government as ordained by God. Therefore, we see that law and commandments, that they're necessary, they're imperative for any society to survive and thrive. But now as we look at this, and the bulk of Scripture is not really dealing with necessarily our responsibility to civil government, but it is dealing with our responsibility towards God, his laws, his commandments, his rules, his regulations. I want to ask you right now, has God established boundaries and parameters and rules and regulations? Has he done that for us? And do we have a responsibility to follow them? Of course we do. And it always comes down to, why does God do what God does? And why does God command or require what God commands? And it's here that I want to call your attention to the reading we had just a couple of moments ago. If you take your Bibles, and please go back to 1 Timothy chapter 1. And I just want to highlight verse number 5. Now, while you're turning back to 1 Timothy 1 and look at verse 5, it's on the slide above here. Do understand that while Paul is going to make his point about the purpose of God's commandments, and he's going to give just as a listing of several of the commandments, as what was read in our hearing just a couple of moments ago. And there was kind of one of those lengthy lists of Paul. Paul loves to give those lists, doesn't he? And of those things that would be considered as violations or transgressions against the will of God. And when you just look at that list and those verses that follow, I want to tell you right now that there's a couple of those that would not be near politically correct today. But has God changed the parameters? Has he changed his law? Has he changed these of what he said here in 1 Timothy in the New Testament? Of course he has not. But the question that I want to address is this. Why? Why? When we look at this, and the Apostle Paul says now, this is the New King James Version, but I've got several renderings that I want us to consider. He says, now the purpose of the commandment is love. From what? A pure heart, love. From a good conscience, love. From a sincere faith. Understand that the love is going to be qualified in those three items. Listen to it again. Now the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith. Now when we look, even as I try to put in a different color here, purpose, because I have the Greek word telos there. The end of which all things relate. We talk about something, the purpose of something. What was the purpose? Why did you do that? What was the purpose? And the Apostle Paul uses this in a very intentional way, found a handful of times in the Greek New Testament, but we find that the end of which all things relate, the aim of something, yes, the purpose. It is why when we look at some of the other translations, the King James Version, for example, says, now the end of the commandment is charity. The end. Here's the end of the thing. But the end of it is not some type of time thing. And here is talking again about this is the purpose. This is what should be the end result of what we're doing. Whereas we see, for example, in the NIV, it says the goal of this command. Free translation, but understands again the nuance. That the goal of the command is love, so on. The ESV, which I've used quite a bit in studies and preaching of late, the ESV says the aim of our charge is love. And finally, today's English version and the apologetic of the UBS, United Bible Society's handbook, translator book, brings out that the very idea, again, is the purpose of this order. They talk about purpose, but the purpose of this order. So not only do we see this purpose, but we're talking about this commandment. It's an order, it's a charge, it's a command. Understand what the Apostle Paul is doing, and here's what I want us to see about this. God is just as concerned as why we obey Him as how we obey Him, causing us to focus on the purpose of the commandments. I do not want to be misunderstood here. Is it important how we obey God, how we serve God? Is it important how we worship God? Is that important how? Of course it is. But is it equally important not only how we are to do all of that, but why we do it? And I think this is an aspect that sometimes people have a tendency to forget. Not just the how, but the why. And the thought occurred to me the other day as I was preparing for this, is that I understand, and I preached this lesson many times and made the point many times, that we as faithful, loyal children of God, we're going to do what God says, we're going to do what He says the way God says, and we're going to do it because He says He's the authority. But I do want to say this at the same time. God is not one who just gives arbitrary commandments. That it is never a situation in the mind of God. God's not a because I told you so God. He just isn't. He's not a because I told you so. Now sometimes we as parents, anybody here besides Vicky and myself, ever say to our children at some point in their life, and when they said, well, why do I have to do that? And if any of you ever said besides us, because I told you so. Anybody else? Now, maybe it's because they were too young and wouldn't understand anyway. Maybe it's because of the time factor. I don't have time to tell you right now, but just do it because I'm the boss applesauce. And maybe I'll tell you later, right? Why are you looking at them that way? We understand that, but hopefully there is a good, sound reason or purpose of why we may instruct our children certain things. And there always is with God. He's not a just because I said so God. That there is always a purpose of why God does what He does. Well, then I want us to understand there must be a purpose of why we do what we do. There has to be a purpose behind that. And the Apostle Paul is outlining that. He's making it very clear. Now the purpose, the end, the goal, the aim of this commandment, of this charge, of this order is what? Love. Love from this pure heart, good conscience, and sincere faith. That's what we want to develop. Now, having said that, when we look at the purpose of God's commandments, we do have to give this kind of warning, and the warning is this: beware of self-seeking agendas. There are times that people may do, Christians in the body of Christ, historically, people that were people of God, covenant people of God. But there are sometimes that they did the commandments, but their motives were all wrong. And they did it because it was some self-seeking type of thing, some self-glorification. And that's what I want us to be aware of, that we must make sure that we are never doing what God says based upon selfish motives. Does that make sense where I'm going with that? Now you think about this, and I think, remember of the Pharisee that He exposes in Luke chapter 18. And I'll tell you what he had. He kind of had this look at me. And Jesus taught this parable because there were those that trusted in themselves that they were righteous and they despised others. How hypocritical, but notwithstanding, this is what Jesus shows in this individual. And remember, this individual, he goes up and and what does he do? And he just is very vain, he's very arrogant, and God, I do this and I do that, and I give alms and I do all of these wonderful things, and it's kind of a look at me, and I'm not like other men, I'm not like this sinner over here. Now I want to ask you, do you think he said his prayers? Oh, he said his prayers. He probably did so very regularly, very habitually. But any time that we do something that it's a look at me now, it's standing in contrast to that, was of all things, was this man that would be despised in most situations. And he smote himself on the breast and he says, God be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus says, I tell you, who's going to go down to his house justified? We've got to always be careful that what we do is not because it's a look at me. and all the things that we might be able to perform or do, the commands that we keep, and all of the I's that we dot and the T's that we cross. And I'll tell you, it's important to dot the I's and cross the T's, but it should never be look at me. In fact, that really speaks in so many respects of vainglory and pride, arrogance, doesn't it? You know what the scriptures say. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before the destruction, the haughty spirit before the fall. Don't do it. We don't do it for that reason. Furthermore, then what about even dishonest gain? Because we think there's something I can get out of this. Something that I can get out of this. And so, oh yeah, I can do that. I'll do that. And I'll keep that commandment, or I'll do that service or that duty or whatever the case is. And it may be something that's a very good work, that it might even benefit somebody else. But I want to tell you again, when it comes down to motives, if it's for dishonest gain of something that I can get out of it, then I'm not being honest about it. I'm not being honest with God. I'm not being honest with others. I tell you what, I'm not being honest with self. What really serves as a great example of that? Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5, they just seen the great example of Barnabas in chapter 4, who sold a possession and gave to people that were in need. And Ananias and Sapphira, they take some property and they sell it. Now, Peter would later tell them, did they not have the right to do with it what they wanted? It was their property. But what did they do? They kept some back, privately, secretly. And then as they gave some of these proceeds to the apostles, they wanted the apostles and the others to believe what? That everything that we got from this, here we're laying it at your feet. And you know what Peter tells them they've done? You've lied to God. You've lied to the Holy Spirit. The point is that they thought they could gain something out of this. Not only hanging on to some of their money, which is a financial, greedy, covetous problem, no doubt, in their minds, but there's something else that they were trying to gain. And they're trying to gain this kind of respect that is nothing more than a dishonest respect, is what they're trying to acquire. And so we look at that text, and when they're each asked individually, the man, is this what you did? Yes, this is what I did. Why have you lied to the Holy Spirit? And I'll tell you what, he dropped dead right there and carried out. Then his wife comes in. And is it such and such? Oh, yes, it is. And she doesn't know what happened to her husband. He says, why have you conspired to do such a thing? The same men that just carried out your dead husband are going to carry you out. And you know what it says in verse 11? Then fear came upon the whole church. I guess. But here's the point. They weren't being honest. There's this dishonest gain. And we know what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He talks about contentment, godliness, contentment. There's the great gain. When we're content with what we have, when we become godly. And he gives the warning. He gives the warning that we're all familiar with in 1 Timothy 6:10, that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. People are going to fall by that. And how many people today, that they're thinking more about gain and what they can gain? Financially, monetarily, physically or materially, emotionally, all these different things because it's a wrong motive. The purpose of God's commandments should never be a self-seeking agenda, is my point. And then even when it comes to prayers, remember what James said in James chapter 4 and verse 3. And he tells these people, and many of whom have been a wicked, corrupt, adulterous generation. As much as Jesus had told them, James has told them the same thing. He said, much of you are murderers and adulterers, and he talked about so many of them, of the hypocritical lives that they were living. And then he even addressed their prayer life. And listen to this carefully. Because we know how important prayer life is, and to say our prayers. But in James 4:3, he says, you ask, and you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, the New American Standard says. That you may spend it out of pleasure. You know, the King James, New King James says you ask amiss. Maybe language we don't use quite so much today. But that's what it is, asking amiss. You're asking in a way which you don't have the right to do. It's amiss. Then I thought about that not only these selfish motives have become these self-seeking agendas of why we do what we do sometimes, even when, from the outside it may look very good. The praying Pharisee, the giving Ananias and Sapphira, and so forth. But then I thought about this. How many times do we see others that take advantage of Christians, that is exploiting Christians? That there are those, and so sometimes what happens when it comes down to the purpose of God's commandments and what we need to know, sometimes what's going to make that difficult is because there are those that will try to exploit our good-naturedness, if you will. Allow me to illustrate with some applications here. And I want to say this very, very fervently. There are times that we are tempted or put ourselves in positions to forsake God when we find ourselves almost as though we were pushed in a corner in a very tough situation that we've got to please somebody else. And my thought is this, my conclusion is this that I want us to really dwell upon and think. When pleasing others causes us to forsake God, the agenda is wrong. When pleasing others in any way, shape, or form causes us to forsake God, then the agenda is wrong. Now let me just say, by virtue of biblical principle, we ought to please God and not men. That should be our priority. Galatians chapter 1 and verse 10, Paul says, "For now do I persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I still please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ." Paul knew that in the many, many trials that he faced, if he was going to be a man pleaser, there's no way he would ever been a committed Christian. No way. The same author, the Apostle Paul, but in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 4 says, "But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts." And all I can say, my friends, is that we've got to always look at this and look at our scenarios or situations, the events in life, and say, who do I want to please first? Who do I want to please the most? What am I going to do with this? Pleasing men or pleasing God? And when we find ourselves over and over again that we're pleasing men because of whatever the situation is, and it's taking us away more and more and more away from God, I tell you what, we need to do some reevaluation. For example, how many of you here have ever had a job? And your employer or your boss, and when you went to get that job and you're interviewing for the job and so forth, and say, I'd like to have this job and so forth, but I need to be able to, for example, work in such a way that it does not interfere with my ability to worship God. My ability to go to church services and worship God sometime on a Sunday. And how many times do we have that? We make that request and some will say, "Oh, yeah, no problem." "Oh, no problem." And then some time goes by and pretty soon, "Well, we need you to do this and we need you to do that." And pretty soon say, "Wait a minute, I've got to be able to worship either in the morning or in the evening, but I need to worship." Well, we're in a situation here and and all of a sudden we've got a choice to make. Now I realize we have lots of different kinds of jobs. We have people shift work that we have nurses and we have people in the fire department and law enforcement and all these kinds of things, these kinds of shift work and others too that rotate in various things. And I'll tell you what, I think that we're very blessed that we have the opportunity, the ability, for example, to be able to meet 2 times on Sunday and have a commodious place to do it. Is that a blessing? It really is. And some of them know the story because I used to work at the same place that some of these people worked a long, long time ago. And when I talked to my employer one time, and he said, "Brent, I got a situation. I need you to work the split on Sunday." And he told me, man, I'll tell you what, he's going to have me come in and do prep work and get him through the lunch hour and then take a little break in the afternoon and then come back for dinner time and then work then. And I just said, "But I can't do that." He goes, "What do you mean you can't do that?" I'm in a situation. I said, No, I'm in a situation. I said, "I'll tell you what I'll do." I said, "I'll come in, I'll do all the prep, and I'll work straight through." I said, "I'll work from early in the morning and right up to about 5:15. I'm going to go worship real quick. I'll come back, and I can be back probably about 7-ish or shortly after 7, finish the dinner, do all the cleanup. I don't care if I go home 1 o'clock in the morning and you can pay me for 8 hours. How about that?" Exactly what I told him. I said, "But I will not split this up where I cannot worship God." And he says, No, you don't have to do all that. I'll never forget that. You don't have to do all that. And we worked it out. Now he was being very reasonable and fair once I explained the situation. But brother, I'm going to tell you that we have to be very careful that when we put ourselves in situations in where we all of a sudden, well, I've got to please my employer, or and it's not just that. It can happen on the job. It could happen at school. It could happen in nonprofit organizations. It can happen in the family, can it? But when we find ourselves pleasing others, whereby we are forsaking our responsibility towards God, we've got to start looking at the purpose of the commandment, which is love. Now, that's why we always have this man versus God thing. What does Peter say in Acts chapter 5, verse 1? For we ought to obey God rather than man. We get that. We understand that. How often do we quote? And we have this incredible statement made by Joshua in Joshua 24:15. And he just makes it so clear. If it seems equal to you to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you're going to serve. I mean, we have that choice. We have that choice to make. He says, if it's going to be the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites who land you now dwell, he says, you make the choice. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That takes a commitment, and it's an understanding the purpose of the commandment and the purpose of our whole attitude towards the commandment. Now, we come to this last part, and now I would just look at these, and I found some very interesting things about these expressions used. Now again, the godly purpose seeks agape love. And it's the word that he uses. It's the type of love. He doesn't use storge and he doesn't use phileo, but he uses agape. This giving, this sacrificial that is not based upon reciprocity. I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back. No, it's agape, giving, sacrificial, deep, deep love. Now the purpose of the commandment is love. From a pure heart, from a good conscience, sincere faith. And somebody says, well, what does agape love look like? And what does Scripture say? Turn over to 1 Corinthians 13. Many of you can quote this or can paraphrase it quite well. But please turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 in your Bibles. And after Paul begins to show what this greatest gift is going to be and what it's going to look like, and shows that the motive of what we should do is always love. That's what he does in those first few verses. It doesn't make any difference if you feed the poor, if you give your body to be burned. If it's not based upon the motive of love, it's of no value. He says, but here's what this agape love looks like. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 4. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. This quality of agape love, according to the first part of verse 8, is never fails. Love never fails. Now, first of all, this is not a subjective, pick which one of those principles or statements that you like and would like to apply to your life. This is what love looks like is to be and what we're to practice and to be seen in our lives. And it shows us what it is and what it is not at the same time. You see, it's this kind of agape love that causes one to honor God and to treat others equitably. When the attorney in Matthew 22, that lawyer comes up and he's talking to Jesus about their greatest commandment. What's the greatest commandment? And what does Jesus say to him? We look at this and we know what the greatest commandment is. The greatest commandment is to love God with all of your heart, your mind, your soul, your spirit, your strength, your being. Love God with all your being. And he says, and the second is like the first, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. It is that which is going to honor God, and it's a kind of love that's going to put others before self, not again for selfish motives reasons, or allowing people just to exploit us because we're Christians and to take advantage of our good-naturedness. But no, that we understand that we are going to love because we want to walk and talk and think and be like Jesus. I love Romans 13. We just read verses 1 through 7 at the beginning. It talks about civil government, right? You know, the very next verse says in verse 8, right after Paul talks about here is government and its purpose and what it is to do and how God has even ordained it to be, then he goes right into this in verse 8. Owe no one anything except to love one another. Why does he say that? He just told them, you've got to pay taxes. Frankly, I wish he would have not done that. Well, anyway. But he did. So when I look at this, so now I owe the government. Well, you know what? You may owe the government taxes. But when you really want to talk about what we owe one another, and we have to deal with government and has this purpose. But now as he's speaking to them, as relating one to another, as brethren in Christ, owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbors yourself. That's what Jesus emphasized. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. No wonder the Scripture is saying that the purpose of the commandment is seen in our seeking agape love. Love is the fulfillment of the law. It's fulfillment of what God has given us. And I'll tell you what, it epitomizes the golden rule of Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. As we paraphrase that, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Now, here's what I found interesting as we close. In fact, I'm just going to expose all three of these. That godly purpose seeks agape love. And he says the purpose of the commandment, the aim of this commandment, the goal of this charge of this commandment is love. And understand that in the structure of the sentence, the love is to be attached grammatically in the structure of the sentence and its verbiage. The love is to be attached to all three of these principles. A pure heart, a good conscience, sincere faith. And what I found very interesting about that, and that of course is the expression that was written by Paul in 1 Timothy 1:5, our text, that Paul uses those three phrases in a few other places in the exact same phrase, the exact same words, the exact same cognate form. You could simply cut and paste if you wanted exactly from the Greek text. It's there. Syntactically relevant. The purpose of the commandment is love, but from where? And this is what brings us to our attitude, our motive. This is what I want us to close on and understand. That we're talking about love from a pure heart. And that's always going to deal with a sense of goodness, purity, yes, of morality, in our ethics, in our morals, in our even in our position and station in community. The purpose of the commandment